Lightning split the bruised sky above Coyote Hollow's weathered chapel, casting harsh shadows across the faces of the wedding guests who had come not to celebrate, but to witness what many whispered would be the town's cruelest joke. Dinah McCrae stood at the altar in her carefully mended dress, the cream-colored silk that had belonged to her mother now patched with scraps of calico and gingham, each piece a testament to her family's fall from grace since the mine collapse that claimed her father and their fortune 3 years prior. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, her thick fingers working by candlelight to alter the dress that hung loose on her generous frame. The other women in town had snickered behind their fans about Tommy Brewster's choice of bride, but Dinah had clung to the hope that love might triumph over their cruelty. She had practiced her vows in the cracked mirror of her boarding house room, imagining the moment when she would finally belong somewhere to someone. Now, as thunder rumbled overhead and the first fat drops of rain began to spatter against the chapel windows, Tommy Brewster stood before her with a sneer that transformed his boyish features into something ugly and cold. The congregation held its collective breath, sensing the drama about to unfold. "You really thought I'd go through with this farce?" The words hit Dinah like a physical blow, but it was the laughter that followed first from Tommy, then spreading through the pews like wildfire that shattered something deep inside her chest. She watched in stunned silence as Tommy reached for the bouquet of wild prairie roses she had picked herself that morning, their stems carefully wrapped in a ribbon saved from her mother's sewing box. He flung the flowers to the chapel floor and ground them under his boot heel, the delicate petals bleeding crimson across the dusty planks. Behind her, Dinah heard Mrs. Abernathy whisper sharply to her young son, who had begun to giggle. But the damage was done. Even 7-year-old Billy Abernathy understood what the adults were too polite to say aloud. That Dinah McCrae was too fat, too poor, too desperate to deserve happiness. Among the faces in the crowd, Dinah caught sight of her former friend Martha Henley, who had once shared secrets and dreams with her behind the schoolhouse. Martha's eyes met hers for a split second before the woman looked away, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment, not for the cruelty being inflicted, but for having once called Dinah a friend. "I made a wager with the boys at Sullivan's Saloon," Tommy continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the chapel. $50, they bet me I wouldn't have the stomach to stand you up at the altar. Easiest money I ever made. The admission sent a fresh wave of laughter through the congregation, though some had the decency to look ashamed. Judge Crawford shifted uncomfortably in his front row seat, and Dr. Patterson frowned deeply, but neither man spoke up. In Coyote Hollow, as in most frontier towns, a woman's humiliation was considered unfortunate but unremarkable. Dinah felt the familiar burn of tears behind her eyes. But she had learned long ago that crying only gave cruel people more satisfaction. Instead, she lifted her chin and looked directly at Tommy, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Then I reckon you've shown everyone exactly what kind of man you are, Tommy Brewster, and what kind of people they are for finding sport in it." The laughter died abruptly. In the sudden silence broken only by the increasing patter of rain against glass, Dinah gathered what remained of her dignity and walked down the aisle. Her heavy footsteps echoed in the chapel as she passed row after row of faces, some sheepish, now others still openly amused, a few showing something that might have been sympathy. She paused at the doorway to look back at the congregation one last time, her gaze settling on the crushed roses scattered at the altar. "I hope you all remember this day," she said quietly, her words carrying despite their softness. "I hope you remember what you chose to be." The storm that had threatened during the wedding broke with full fury as Dinah made her way through Coyote Hollow's muddy streets. Rain lashed her face and soaked through her wedding dress, turning the patched silk heavy and clinging. She had nowhere to go. Her room at Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house was paid only through the end of the week, and she had spent her last dollars on the wedding preparations, foolishly believing she would soon be Mrs. Tommy Brewster with a home of her own. Coyote Hollow sprawled across a harsh plateau where the desert met the mountains, a town born from silver strikes and sustained by the determination of men and women willing to scratch a living from unforgiving ground. The main street stretched between weathered storefronts and saloons, flanked by houses that ranged from the modest but respectable homes of successful merchants to the ramshackle shanties of those who had come seeking fortune and found only hardship. At the town's eastern edge, where the plateau began its descent toward the Badlands, stood the shell of what had once been the Hollow House, a grand hotel built during the silver boom and abandoned when the easy ore played out. Dinah had explored the ruins as a child when her father still owned the McCrae mine, and their family held a position of respect in the community. Now, with rain streaming down her face and her wedding dress clinging to her like a shroud, she found herself drawn back to that childhood refuge. The building's once elegant facade had weathered to gray, its windows broken, and its paint peeling away in long strips that fluttered in the wind like tattered flags. But the structure remained sound, built from stone and timber by men who had expected their boomtown to last forever. Dinah pushed through the warped front door and into the vast lobby where dust motes danced in the gray light, filtering through broken glass. She climbed the grand staircase, her wet boots echoing in the emptiness, and found a room on the second floor where the roof remained intact. The chamber had once been furnished for wealthy travelers, but now contained only a few pieces of broken furniture and a mattress that mice had claimed for nesting. It would have to do. As night fell and the storm continued to rage, Dinah sat on the old mattress and carefully removed her mother's dress. By candlelight, she had found a stub of wax in the abandoned hotel's kitchen. She began to tear the dress apart, separating the patches she had so carefully sewn together. Each piece of fabric represented a memory: the blue gingham from her school dress, the yellow calico from a Sunday frock, the cream silk that had once been her mother's pride. She folded each piece carefully and placed them in her carpet bag, the only possession of value she had left. These scraps would become something new, she decided. Something that belonged entirely to her. The candle burned low as Dinah wrapped herself in her father's old coat. But the only thing of his she had managed to keep when their possessions were sold to pay debts, and tried to sleep. Through the broken windows, she could hear the storm beginning to subside, and in the distance, the mournful howl of coyotes that gave the town its name. She woke at dawn to the sound of voices, young voices frightened and hungry. Creeping to the window, she peered down into the hotel's overgrown courtyard and saw two children huddled beneath the sagging remains of what had once been an elegant gazebo. A boy of perhaps 10 and a girl who could not have been more than 7, both dressed in clothes that had seen better days, sharing what appeared to be a handful of berries. Dinah watched them for several minutes, noting the way the boy kept glancing around nervously while the girl clung to his arm. Runaways, most likely, or orphans, trying to avoid being shipped off to one of the territorial workhouses where children were treated little better than slaves. She had no food to offer them. Her own stomach had been empty since the previous morning. But she found herself calling softly from the window. "You children can come inside if you want to get out of the damp. There's shelter here." The boy looked up sharply, his hand moving to what was probably a knife hidden in his ragged coat. His face was pinched with suspicion and premature hardness, but his eyes held the same desperation that Dinah had seen in her own reflection. "We don't want no trouble, ma'am." He called back, his voice cracking with the strain of trying to sound grown up. "Neither do I," Dinah replied. "But trouble seems to find us anyway, doesn't it? Might as well face it together." After a long moment, the boy helped his sister to her feet, and they made their way into the hotel. Dinah met them in the lobby, still wearing her father's oversized coat over her chemise and petticoat. In the morning light streaming through the broken windows, she could see that both children were painfully thin, their clothes more patches than original fabric. "I'm Jake," the boy said cautiously. "This here's Sarah. We ain't done nothing wrong." "I'm Dinah," she replied gently. "And I believe you. What brings you to my palace?" The attempt at humor coaxed a tiny smile from Sarah, who had been hiding behind her brother's thin frame. Jake, however, remained wary. "Ain't your palace, ma'am. This place don't belong to nobody." "Then I suppose that makes us all trespassers together." Dinah said. "Have you eaten?" The children exchanged glances, and their silence was answer enough. Dinah opened her carpet bag and pulled out a small cloth bundle that had the remains of a loaf of bread she had saved from Mrs. Fletcher's kitchen, originally intended for her wedding breakfast. She broke it into 3 pieces and handed the larger portions to Jake and Sarah. "It's not much," she admitted, "but it's what I have." As they shared the meager meal, the children's story emerged in fits and starts. Their parents had died in a mine accident 2 months prior, and they had been staying with an uncle who drank away his wages and took his frustrations out on anyone smaller than himself. They had run away 3 days ago and been hiding in various abandoned buildings around town, scrounging for food and trying to avoid the attention of Marshal Weller, who was known to ship orphans off to territorial institutions without bothering to investigate their circumstances. "Marshal says it's for our own good," Jake explained, his young voice heavy with bitter experience. "But Tommy Hartwell got sent to one of them places last year, and when he came back for his aunt's funeral, he was missing 2 fingers and wouldn't talk about what happened." Dinah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She had heard whispers about the territorial workhouses institutions ostensibly designed to care for orphan children, but widely suspected of being little more than sources of cheap labor for mining companies and large ranches. "Well then," she said, making a decision that would change all their lives, "I suppose we'll have to make sure Marshal Weller doesn't find you." Over the following days, word spread through Coyote Hollow's network of forgotten people that the old Hollow House had become a refuge. More children appeared, Mary Donovan, 16 and pregnant, cast out by her family when they learned of her condition. Little Emma Patterson, whose parents had died of fever and whose remaining relatives lived too far away to claim her quickly. The Chen brothers, whose Chinese father had been murdered by claim jumpers and whose white mother had abandoned them rather than face the town's prejudice. Dinah found herself the unlikely matriarch of a household that defied every convention of frontier society. She had no legal claim to the children, no official authority to care for them, and no resources beyond her determination and the skills her mother had taught her. But she had something else, the absolute certainty that someone needed to stand between these forgotten children and a world that saw them as problems to be disposed of rather than people to be protected. She began to organize their days with the efficiency of a woman accustomed to making do with less. The older children, Jake, Mary, and the Chen brothers, were assigned to forage for food and salvageable materials, while Sarah and Emma helped with cooking and mending. Dinah herself took on the most dangerous task, venturing into town to trade her sewing skills for supplies, always careful to avoid Marshal Weller and his deputies. The residents of Coyote Hollow began to notice the activity at the old hotel, and opinions were sharply divided. Some, like Dr. Patterson, quietly approved of what Dinah was doing and occasionally left anonymous bundles of food or medicine where she could find them. Others, led by the morally righteous Mrs. Henderson, were scandalized by the idea of an unmarried woman living in sin with a collection of bastards and thieves. "It's an affront to decent society," Mrs. Henderson proclaimed at the weekly ladies' auxiliary meeting. "That woman has no business playing mother to children who aren't hers. Mark my words, no good will come of it." But Judge Crawford, whose wife had died in childbirth years earlier, surprised everyone by defending Dinah's actions. "The woman is providing care for children who would otherwise have none," he said firmly. "In my experience, the law is meant to serve justice, not convenience. And there's nothing just about punishing children for the circumstances of their birth." It was on a cold October morning, 6 weeks after the wedding, that never was, that Marshal Blake Weller finally decided to take action against what he termed the McCrae situation. He arrived at the Hollow House with 2 deputies in tow, their badges glinting in the weak autumn sunlight, and their hands resting conspicuously on their gun butts. Weller was a man shaped by disappointment and hardened by the casual cruelties of frontier life. At 45, he had served as Coyote Hollow's law enforcement for nearly a decade, and his methods had grown increasingly harsh as the silver played out, and the town's population became more desperate. He had lost his own son to pneumonia 3 years earlier, and some said the tragedy had twisted something inside him, making him see threats where others saw only need. Dinah met them at the hotel's front door, her chin raised and her hands steady despite the fear that clawed at her chest. Behind her, she could hear the children gathering in the lobby, their whispered conversations betraying their anxiety. "Marshal Weller," she said formally. "What brings you to my home?" "This ain't your home, Miss McCrae." Weller replied, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to obedience. "This is abandoned property, and you're trespassing. More importantly, you're harboring runaways and fugitives." "I'm caring for children who have nowhere else to go," Dinah corrected him. "Since when is charity a crime?" "Since it interferes with lawful authority," Weller snapped. "These children are wards of the territory. They belong in proper institutions where they can be educated and put to useful work." The phrase "useful work" sent a chill through everyone present. In territorial parlance, it was a euphemism for the kind of labor that had broken Tommy Hartwell's fingers and left other children with scars, both physical and psychological. "They're getting education here," Dinah said firmly. "I teach them reading and writing, arithmetic and history. They're learning skills that will serve them well in life. You're teaching them to defy authority and live outside the law," Weller retorted. "That's not education, that's corruption." One of his deputies, a young man named Collins, who had arrived in town only recently, shifted uncomfortably. He could see the children gathered behind Dinah, clean, well-fed, and obviously cared for, and they didn't match the picture of criminal neglect that Weller had painted. "Ma'am," Collins ventured hesitantly, "maybe we could work something out. If you could get proper legal guardianship." "Collins," Weller's voice cracked like a whip. "You're here to enforce the law, not negotiate with criminals." The marshal's eyes fixed on Dinah with undisguised hostility. There was something personal in his animosity. She realized something that went beyond his official duties or even his reputation for harshness. "You have until the end of the week to turn these children over to proper authorities," he continued. "If you don't, I'll arrest you for kidnapping and trespassing, and the children will be removed by force." "And if I refuse?" Dinah asked quietly. Weller's smile was cold and humorless. "Then you'll find out just how seriously the territory takes the protection of innocent children from unfit guardians." After the marshal and his deputies left, Dinah gathered the children in the hotel's old dining room. The space had once hosted elegant dinner parties for wealthy travelers, but now it served as their communal meeting place, furnished with salvaged chairs and tables that wobbled on uneven legs. "What are we going to do?" Jake asked, his young voice tight with worry. At barely 10 years old, he had already learned that adults rarely kept their promises to protect children, and the thought of being sent to a territorial workhouse filled him with dread. "We're going to fight," Dinah said simply. "I don't know how yet, but we're not giving up." Mary Donovan, her pregnancy now showing clearly beneath her patched dress, looked up from the sock she was mending. "Fighting Marshal Weller ain't like fighting other folks, Dinah. He's got the law on his side." "He's got the appearance of law," Dinah corrected. "There's a difference between doing what's legal and doing what's right." That night, as the children slept in the various rooms they had claimed throughout the hotel, Dinah sat by the window of her own chamber and began to sew. She had salvaged fabric from abandoned houses throughout the town, scraps of curtains, pieces of worn clothing, fragments of quilts that had been left behind when families moved on or died off. Now she began to piece them together into something new. Each stitch was deliberate, each pattern meaningful. This would not be just a quilt, but a record, a testament to the lives that had been cast aside and forgotten now, given new purpose and beauty. As her needle moved through the fabric, Dinah found herself thinking about the marshal's obvious hostility toward her personally, and she began to piece together fragments of memory. Blake Weller's brother had been foreman at the McCrae mine when it collapsed. He had been one of the men whose bodies were never recovered from the cave-in that killed Dinah's father and 17 other miners. In the aftermath, there had been an investigation, and Dinah's father had left behind detailed records suggesting that proper safety protocols had not been followed. The territorial inspector had used those records to build a case of criminal negligence against the mines management company, a case that had ultimately led to several men being hanged, including Blake Weller's brother. Now she understood the personal vendetta that drove the Marshal's actions. This wasn't about law enforcement or child welfare, it was about revenge. The attack came 3 days before Weller's deadline in the dark hours before dawn, when the hotel was quiet and the children slept deeply. Dinah woke to the sound of breaking glass and the acrid smell of kerosene. She stumbled from her bed, her heart hammering as she realized that the glow outside her window wasn't the sunrise, but flames licking at the hotel's ground floor. "Fire!" she screamed, racing through the hallways and pounding on doors. "Everyone up, fire!" The children emerged from their rooms in various states of undress, coughing as smoke began to seep upward through the building's old floorboards. Sarah was crying, her small hand clutching Emma's as they stumbled toward the main staircase. Jake had thrown on his clothes and was already helping Mary, whose advanced pregnancy made moving quickly difficult. The stairs are blocked. Collins, the young deputy, appeared at the top of the staircase, his face streaked with soot. "The whole lobby's going up." For a moment, Dinah stared at him in confusion. Then she realized that Collins wasn't there as part of an official response. He was there as an arsonist who had developed second thoughts. "You did this," she accused, but there was no time for anger. Smoke was filling the hallway, and the flames below were growing louder and more intense. "The back stairs," Jake shouted, pointing toward the servants' staircase at the rear of the building. "I found them last week." They moved as a group through the thickening smoke, Dinah carrying Emma, while Jake helped Sarah and Collins assisted Mary. The Chen brothers brought up the rear, making sure no one was left behind. The narrow servants' staircase was still clear, though they could hear the fire spreading through the walls around them. As they reached the ground floor, a section of ceiling collapsed behind them, sending up a shower of sparks and burning timber. They burst through the kitchen door into the cold October air, gasping and coughing as they stumbled away from the building. It was then that Dinah realized Sarah was missing. "Where's Sarah?" she demanded, grabbing Jake's shoulders. The boy's face went white as he looked around the group of soot-covered refugees. "She was right behind me," he gasped. She was holding Emma's hand. But Emma was there, clinging to Mary's skirts, and Sarah was not. Through the kitchen windows, they could see that the fire had spread to the second floor, and the servants' staircase they had just used was now completely engulfed. Without hesitation, Dinah ran back toward the burning building. Collins tried to grab her arm, but she shook him off and plunged through the kitchen door into the smoke and heat. The narrow hallway was like a furnace, and she had to drop to her hands and knees to breathe as she crawled toward the main lobby. She found Sarah trapped under a fallen beam near the hotel's front desk, conscious but unable to move. The 7-year-old was trying not to cry, though tears streamed down her smoke-stained cheeks. "I got turned around in the smoke," Sarah whispered. "I couldn't find the way out." The beam was too heavy for Dinah to lift alone, but she managed to work one end up enough for Sarah to wiggle free. As they struggled toward the exit, a section of the grand staircase collapsed in a roar of flame and falling timber blocking their path to the kitchen. Desperation gave Dinah strength she didn't know she possessed. She picked up Sarah and ran toward the front windows, using a piece of fallen timber to smash through the remaining glass. They tumbled through the opening just as the entire front wall of the hotel began to buckle and sag. Outside, the other children rushed to embrace Sarah, while Collins stared at the burning building with obvious guilt and horror. "Marshal said it would just scare you off." He mumbled, his voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. "He said the building was empty anyway, that you'd already moved the kids somewhere safe. And you believed him." Dinah's voice was hoarse from smoke, but her anger was clear. Collins couldn't meet her eyes. "He said you were harboring criminals, that the children were being corrupted. He made it sound like we were doing something righteous." The sound of hoofbeats interrupted their conversation as a lone rider approached through the dawn gloom. The man who dismounted was tall and lean with the weathered skin of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. His left arm was missing below the elbow, and his long black hair was streaked with premature gray. This was Hawk Tallbear, a half-Cheyenne former outlaw who had been living as a hermit in the hills above town since his release from territorial prison 2 years earlier. "Saw the smoke from my camp," he said simply, his dark eyes taking in the scene, the burning hotel, the soot-covered children, and Collins standing apart from the group with guilt written across his features. Dinah had heard stories about Hawk Tallbear, most of them contradictory. Some said he was a dangerous killer who had murdered a dozen men in cold blood. Others claimed he was a hero who had fought to protect his people's land from greedy settlers. What everyone agreed on was that he was best left alone. "We need shelter," Dinah said, too exhausted and desperate to care about Hawk's reputation. "The children need somewhere safe to stay." Hawk studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded toward the hills. "There's an old line shack about 5 miles up the canyon. It's not much, but it's sound and defensible. You can stay there until you figure out what comes next." "Why would you help us?" Mary asked suspiciously. The stories about Hawk Tallbear had made their way even to the children, and she wasn't sure they should trust him. Hawk's expression softened slightly, and for a moment the hardness left his eyes. "Because I had children once," he said quietly. "And when they needed help, no one offered it." As they gathered what few possessions they could salvage from the ruins of the hotel, Dinah noticed Collins mounting his horse to ride back to town. The young deputy looked like a man carrying a terrible weight, and she found herself hoping that his conscience would prove stronger than his loyalty to Marshal Weller. The line shack Hawk had mentioned was indeed humble. A single room with a stone fireplace, plank walls, and a roof that leaked in only a few places. But it was shelter, and after the terror of the fire, it felt like a palace. The children huddled together around the fireplace, while Dinah and Hawk worked to make the space as comfortable as possible. "This won't hold them for long," Hawk warned as he helped arrange blankets on the floor. "Weller's not the type to give up after one failure. He'll come after you again, and next time he might not worry about making it look like an accident. Then we'll be ready for him." Dinah replied with more confidence than she felt. Over the following days, Hawk proved to be an invaluable ally. He knew the country around Coyote Hollow like few others, and he used that knowledge to keep the children safe, while Dinah worked on a plan to expose Marshal Weller's corruption. More importantly, he understood what it meant to be an outcast, and he had no patience for the kind of moral hypocrisy that allowed respectable people to turn their backs on suffering children. He began teaching Jake and the Chen brothers how to move through the wilderness without leaving track skills that might prove crucial if they had to run again. He showed Mary how to identify edible plants and clean water sources. Most surprisingly, he proved to have a gentle way with the younger children, telling them stories of his grandmother's people and helping them understand that being different didn't make them worthless. "My grandmother used to say that the broken places are where the light gets through," he told Sarah one evening as she helped him tend a small fire outside the cabin. "Every scar tells a story of surviving something that tried to destroy you." Meanwhile, Dinah was working on her quilt with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Each night by the light of the fire, she added new pieces to the growing tapestry of fabric scraps. The patterns were becoming more complex, telling a story that she hoped others would be able to read. It was Jake who brought news from town that changed everything. The boy had been scouting around Coyote Hollow's outskirts, practicing the stealth techniques Hawk had taught him when he overheard a conversation between Marshal Weller and a man he didn't recognize. "They was talking about money," Jake reported breathlessly. "Big money. The stranger said something about $50 a head for healthy children and $100 for girls old enough to work in the cribs." Dinah felt her blood turn to ice. The cribs were frontier brothels, and the thought of children being sold into sexual slavery made her physically ill. But it also provided the missing piece of the puzzle. Weller wasn't simply trying to rid the town of unwanted children, he He was profiting from their disappearance. "There's more," Jake continued. "The stranger said something about a shipment going out at the end of the week. Said he had buyers lined up in Denver and San Francisco." Hawk's face had gone stone cold as he listened to Jake's report. "Child trafficking," he said quietly. "It's worse than I thought. We have to stop them," Dinah said firmly. "If we don't, other children will suffer. Fighting Weller head-on won't work," Hawk warned. "He's got legal authority and armed men. We need to be smarter than that." It was Mary who suggested the solution, her voice quiet but determined. "What if we could prove what he's doing? Get evidence that would convince folks in town?" "How?" Dinah asked. Mary's smile was grim but hopeful. "By giving him exactly what he wants and making sure the right people are watching when he takes it." The plan they developed was dangerous and required perfect timing. But it was their only chance to expose Weller's corruption before more children disappeared. Dinah would return to town and surrender herself to the Marshal, claiming that the fire had broken her spirit and convinced her to cooperate. She would offer to help him round up the other children in exchange for lenient treatment. Meanwhile, Hawk would position himself where he could observe and, if necessary, intervene. Jake and the older children would hide in predetermined locations around town, ready to serve as witnesses to whatever transpired. Most crucially, Dr. Patterson, who had been quietly supporting their cause, would ensure that Judge Crawford was present when Weller made his move. The plan's success depended on Weller's greed overcoming his caution and on the hope that there were still enough decent people in Coyote Hollow to be outraged by evidence of child trafficking. On a cold Thursday morning in November, Dinah walked into Coyote Hollow's Marshal's office wearing her patched dress and carrying her carpet bag. Weller looked up from his desk with barely concealed satisfaction as she entered. "Miss McCrae," he said smoothly. "I was wondering when you'd come to your senses." "The fire changed things," Dinah replied, letting exhaustion and defeat color her voice. "I can't keep running, and I can't keep putting the children in danger." "Very wise," Weller said, though his eyes remained cold and calculating. "Where are they now?" "Hiding in the old mine workings up Devil's Canyon," Dinah lied smoothly. "They're scared and hungry. I can bring them in, but I want your word that they'll be treated fairly." Weller's smile was predatory. "Of course. The territory has excellent facilities for caring for orphan children. They'll be fed, clothed, educated, and put to useful work." The phrase "useful work" sent a chill down Dinah's spine. But she forced herself to nod, as if reassured. "When can you have them ready?" Weller continued. "This afternoon," Dinah replied. "But I'll need help bringing them down from the mines. Some of them are pretty young. I'll send Collins and a couple of other men with you." Weller agreed. "We'll have a wagon ready to transport them to the territorial facility." As Dinah left the Marshal's office, she noticed a well-dressed stranger lounging outside Sullivan's saloon. The man was watching her with obvious interest, and she realized this must be the buyer Jake had overheard. The sight of him made her stomach turn, but it also confirmed that they were on the right track. That afternoon, Dinah led Collins and two other deputies up into the hills above town, following a winding trail toward the abandoned McCrae mine. The deputies were armed and alert, but they seemed to believe they were simply collecting frightened children rather than walking into a trap. Collins had been quiet and withdrawn since the night of the fire, and Dinah could see the guilt eating at him. She found herself hoping that when the truth came out, he would find the courage to do the right thing. As they approached the mine entrance, Dinah called out loudly, as if summoning the hidden children. "Jake, Sarah, it's safe to come out now." What emerged from the shadows around the mine weren't children, but Hawk Tallbear and Judge Crawford, both armed and looking grimly determined. Behind them came Dr. Patterson and several other townspeople, including Collins' own father, who served on the town council. "What the hell is this?" Collins demanded, his hand moving toward his gun. "It's justice, son," Judge Crawford replied calmly. "Miss McCrae has told us some very disturbing things about Marshal Weller's plans for these children." One of the other deputies, a man named Morrison, laughed harshly. "You're going to take the word of that fat cow over a sworn lawman." The comment provoked an unexpected reaction from Collins, who spun around and grabbed Morrison by the front of his shirt. "Shut your mouth." Collins snarled. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Easy, son," Judge Crawford said, stepping between the two men. "We're here to sort out the truth, not to fight among ourselves." Dr. Patterson moved forward, his medical bag in one hand and a folded document in the other. "I've been documenting the condition of Miss McCrae's children for weeks," he announced. "They're well-fed, educated, and showing no signs of abuse or neglect. In fact, they're healthier and better cared for than most children in town." "That's not the point," Morrison argued. "She's got no legal right to keep them, and Marshal Weller has no legal right to sell them," Dinah said quietly. The statement hung in the air like a physical presence. Morrison's face went pale while Collins looked like a man watching his world collapse around him. "That's a serious accusation," Judge Crawford said gravely. "Do you have evidence to support it?" It was Jake who answered, emerging from concealment behind a boulder with Sarah and the Chen brothers. "I heard him talking," the boy said firmly. "Marshal Weller and a stranger. They was talking about selling kids for $50 each, more for the girls." "The boy's lying," Morrison insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Jake shot back. "Then how come there's a fancy wagon waiting behind the marshal's office right now with chains and locks built into the sides? How come there's a stranger in town with more money than anyone ought to carry, asking questions about how many kids we got?" Collins was staring at Jake with growing horror. "Is that true?" he whispered. "Of course it's true," Sarah chimed in, her small voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "We seen it when we was scouting the town. Dinah told us to look for anything strange." Judge Crawford turned to Collins with an expression of grave concern. "Deputy Collins, I need you to think very carefully about what you've seen and heard over the past few weeks. Has Marshal Weller done or said anything that might support these accusations?" Collins was quiet for a long moment, his internal struggle visible on his young face. Finally, he looked up with tears in his eyes. "The fire wasn't an accident," he admitted. "Marshal told me to set it. Said it would scare Miss McCrae off and solve the problem peaceful-like. But when I saw them kids trapped in there, saw how close they came to dying." He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The admission was enough to confirm everyone's worst suspicions about Weller's methods. Dr. Patterson stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Collins' shoulder. "You did the right thing by helping them escape," he said quietly. "And you're doing the right thing now by telling the truth." Morrison, realizing that the situation was spiraling beyond his control, made a grab for his gun. But Hawk Tallbear was faster, despite having only one arm. His gun was in his hand and pointed at Morrison's chest before the deputy could clear leather. "I wouldn't," Hawk said conversationally. "I've got nothing left to lose, which makes me considerably more dangerous than you." Morrison slowly raised his hands, his face flushed with anger and fear. "And this is all going to fall apart," he snarled. "Weller's got friends in the territorial government. You think they're going to take the word of a bunch of misfits and criminals over a sworn officer?" "Maybe not," Judge Crawford replied calmly. "But they'll have to take the word of a circuit judge, especially when that judge has physical evidence of criminal conspiracy." He gestured toward Jake, who was holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. The boy unwrapped it to reveal a leather ledger book, its pages filled with handwritten notations. "I found this in the marshal's desk when I was hiding in his office yesterday," Jake explained. "Figured it might be important." Judge Crawford accepted the ledger and flipped through its pages, his expression growing darker with each entry. Names, ages, physical descriptions, and prices. He read aloud. "This documents at least 30 children who have disappeared over the past 2 years, along with the amounts paid for each." Collins made a choking sound as if he might be sick. 30 kids," he whispered. "Jesus, what have we done?" "You've helped a monster," Dinah said bluntly. "But it's not too late to help stop him." The confrontation with Marshal Weller took place in Coyote Hollow's main street, in front of half the town's population. Word had spread quickly about the discovery in the hills, and by the time Judge Crawford's party returned to town, a crowd had gathered outside the marshal's office. Weller emerged from the building with his remaining deputies, his hand resting on his gun butt and his face twisted with rage. Behind him, barely visible through the office window, the well-dressed stranger was hastily packing papers into a leather satchel. "Judge Crawford," Weller called out, his voice carrying across the street. "I understand you've been listening to some wild stories from known criminals and troublemakers. I've been investigating credible allegations of child trafficking and conspiracy," Crawford replied formally. "Blake Weller, by the authority vested in me by the territorial government, you are under arrest." Weller's laugh was harsh and humorless. "On whose authority? The word of a disgraced deputy and a bunch of unwanted brats." "On the authority of this," Crawford said, holding up the ledger. "Your own handwriting documenting your crimes in detail." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Weller's features. His eyes darted to the office window where his partner was still frantically gathering evidence. "That don't prove nothing," he said, but his voice lacked its former confidence. "It proves you've been selling children like livestock," Dinah said, stepping forward from the crowd. "It proves you're willing to burn down buildings with kids inside to cover your tracks. It proves you're not a lawman, you're a predator wearing a badge." The crowd was murmuring now, and Dinah could see the shift in public opinion. These were frontier people, accustomed to hard lives and harsh justice. But the abuse of children was a line that even the most callous among them wouldn't cross. Weller's remaining deputies were looking nervous, clearly unwilling to draw their guns against half the town. Only Morrison seemed prepared to fight his hand, hovering near his weapon as he scanned the crowd for threats. It was then that the stranger emerged from the marshal's office, his satchel in one hand and a small pistol in the other. He moved quickly toward a horse tied at the hitching post, clearly intending to flee before the situation deteriorated further. "Nobody move," he shouted, swinging his gun toward the crowd. "I'm leaving, and anyone who tries to stop me will regret it." But he had underestimated both the determination of the townspeople and the skills of Hawk Tallbear. Even as the stranger raised his weapon, Hawk's gun appeared in his hand with deadly efficiency. The shot rang out across the street, and the stranger spun around and collapsed, his weapon clattering across the dusty ground. The gunshot seemed to break the spell that had held everyone frozen. Weller cursed and drew his own gun, but he was facing too many opponents. Judge Crawford had drawn an old Colt revolver from beneath his coat. Dr. Patterson was holding a shotgun with the ease of a man who knew how to use it, and even Collins had his weapon pointed at his former boss. "It's over, Blake," Crawford said sadly. "Put the gun down." For a moment, it seemed like Weller might surrender. Then his face contorted with rage and desperation, and he swung his pistol toward Dinah. "This is all her fault," he screamed. "Her father killed my brother, and she's been nothing but trouble ever since." The gun roared, but Dinah was already moving, diving sideways as Jake tackled her around the waist. The bullet shattered a storefront window behind where she had been standing. Weller never got a chance for a second shot. Hawk's gun spoke again, and the corrupt Marshal fell backward into the street, his weapon spinning away from lifeless fingers. In the sudden silence that followed, broken only by the sound of dust settling and horses stamping nervously, Judge Crawford holstered his weapon and walked over to examine Weller's body. "Justice," he said quietly, though there was no satisfaction in his voice. "Hard and final, but justice nonetheless." Morrison had dropped his gun and was standing with his hands raised, his face pale and desperate. "I didn't know about the kids," he babbled. "I swear I didn't know he was selling them." "Maybe," Crawford replied grimly. "We'll sort that out at your trial." As the crowd began to disperse and the immediate crisis passed, Dinah found herself surrounded by the children she had fought so hard to protect. They clung to her skirts and hugged her arms, their faces showing relief and gratitude. And something deeper, the kind of love that comes from knowing someone has risked everything for your safety. "Is it really over?" Sarah asked, her small voice barely audible. "The dangerous part is," Dinah assured her, "but we still have work to do." The weeks that followed brought changes to Coyote Hollow that no one could have anticipated. Judge Crawford used his authority to establish legal guardianships for all of Dinah's children, cutting through territorial red tape with the efficiency of a man who had been disgusted by what he had discovered. Dr. Patterson was appointed temporary marshal, while the territorial government searched for a replacement, and his first official act was to promote Collins to deputy, with a firm warning about the responsibilities that came with the badge. The stranger who had been shot during the confrontation survived his wounds, and faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a long prison sentence, agreed to testify about the child trafficking network he had been part of. His revelations led to arrests in 3 territories and the rescue of dozens of children who had been sold into various forms of slavery. But perhaps the most significant change was in the attitude of Coyote Hollow's citizens toward Dinah and her unconventional family. The dramatic confrontation had forced people to confront their own prejudices and consider what really mattered in judging a person's worth. Mrs. Henderson, who had been among Dinah's harshest critics, surprised everyone by appearing at the ruins of the Hollow House with a wagon full of supplies and an offer to help with reconstruction. "I was wrong about you," she admitted stiffly, clearly uncomfortable with the apology. "I let gossip and small-mindedness cloud my judgment. What you've done for these children, it's Christian work in the truest sense." The reconstruction of the Hollow House became a community project, with townspeople contributing materials, labor, and expertise. The new building was more modest than the original hotel, but it was designed specifically for its purpose as a home for children who had nowhere else to go. Dinah worked alongside the volunteers, her hammer and saw as active as anyone's, but she spent her evenings working on her quilt. The pattern was nearly complete now, a complex tapestry that told the story of their struggle and triumph. Each piece of fabric represented someone who had been discarded or forgotten, now given new purpose and beauty within the larger design. It was Collins who brought news of the final vindication. The territorial investigation had uncovered evidence that Weller's corruption had extended far beyond Coyote Hollow, and the scandal had led to reform of the entire orphan placement system. More importantly, the territorial legislature had passed new laws protecting the rights of children and establishing strict oversight of institutional placements. "They're calling it the McCrae Act," Collins told her as they watched the children playing in the new house's courtyard. "In honor of what you did here." Dinah felt tears welling in her eyes, but they were tears of gratitude rather than sorrow. "It's not about me," she said softly. "It's about them. About making sure no child ever has to face what they faced." Hawk Tallbear had chosen to stay in Coyote Hollow, taking over the old livery stable and becoming the town's unofficial protector of those who couldn't protect themselves. His presence was a comfort to Dinah and the children, and his skills as a tracker and marksman ensured that the new Hollow House remained a place of safety. "You changed this place," he told Dinah one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. "Not just the building or the laws, but the people. You made them remember what they were supposed to be." "We all changed each other," Dinah replied. "That's how families work." As winter settled over the high country and the first snows began to dust the peaks, Dinah completed her quilt. The finished work was a masterpiece of color and pattern, telling the story of broken things made whole of outcasts who had found each other and created something beautiful from their shared pain. At the center of the quilt was a single patch of cream silk, a piece cut from her ruined wedding dress. Around it, in carefully arranged spirals, were the other scraps, calico and gingham wool and cotton silk and burlap. Each piece was different, but all were bound together by Dinah's patient stitching into a coherent whole that was stronger and more beautiful than any of its individual parts. She hung the quilt in the main room of the new Hollow House, where it would serve as both decoration and reminder. The children traced its patterns with wondering fingers, beginning to understand the story it told. "It's us," Sarah said with the insight that sometimes comes to children. "All different pieces, but we fit together." "That's right," Dinah agreed, gathering the little girl into her arms. "We're all different, but we belong together." That's what makes us a family. Jake, now 11 and growing tall, pointed to the cream silk at the center. What's that piece from? Dinah was quiet for a moment, remembering the woman she had been on that terrible day, when her world had seemed to end. It's from the worst day of my life, she said finally. But it turned out to be the first day of the best life I never knew I wanted. Mary Donovan, who had given birth to a healthy daughter during the reconstruction of the house, smiled from her chair by the fire. Funny how the worst things sometimes lead to the best things. Not funny, Emma Patterson corrected solemnly. The doctor's daughter had been officially adopted by Dinah after her father decided she would be better served by a large, loving family than by his bachelor household. Mysterious. Like how God works. As Christmas approached, the Hollow House filled with the sounds and smells of a large family preparing for celebration. The children had made gifts for each other with scraps of wood and fabric, and Dinah had somehow managed to find small presents for everyone, despite their limited resources. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell gently outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, Dinah stood looking at her quilt and thinking about the strange turns her life had taken. A year ago, she had been a desperate woman facing mockery and abandonment. Now she was the heart of a family that included not only the children under her roof, but a network of friends and allies throughout Coyote Hollow. Judge Crawford had become a regular visitor, often bringing books and papers for the older children's education. Dr. Patterson stopped by weekly to check on everyone's health and stayed for dinner more often than not. Even Mrs. Henderson had taken to sending over surplus vegetables from her garden, always with the excuse that they would otherwise go to waste. Collins had proven to be a steadfast friend and protector, using his authority as a deputy to ensure that the Hollow House remained free from the kind of harassment they had faced under Weller's regime. He had also begun courting Mary Donovan with a patience and gentleness that suggested he understood the value of what he was hoping to win. As the children settled in for the night, each one stopping to kiss Dinah good night and whisper their gratitude for the day's small blessings, she felt a contentment that she had never imagined possible. This was not the life she had planned, but it was the life she had chosen, and in choosing it, she had discovered who she truly was. The last to bid her good night was Sarah, who had become her special companion and helper. Mama Dinah, the child said, using the title that all the children had adopted. Will you tell me again about the quilt? Dinah smiled and pulled the little girl onto her lap, wrapping them both in a soft blanket. Once upon a time, she began, there was a woman who thought her story was over. She had been broken by cruelty and rejected by people who should have shown her kindness. But what she didn't know was that being broken isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning of a new chapter. What happened next? Sarah asked, though she knew the story by heart. She found some other broken people who had been cast aside just like she had. And instead of staying broken and bitter, they decided to help each other heal. They took all their separate pieces, all their scars and fears and hopes, and they sewed them together into something beautiful. Like our quilt. Exactly like our quilt, Dinah agreed. And you know what the most important thing is about quilts? What? They keep you warm. Even when the world outside is cold and cruel, a good quilt will keep you safe and comfortable. That's what families do, they keep each other warm. Sarah nestled closer to Dinah's side, her small hand tracing the patterns on the blanket that covered them. I love our family quilt, she murmured sleepily. So do I, sweetheart, Dinah whispered. So do I. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the harsh landscape in a blanket of white that made even the most forbidding terrain look peaceful and beautiful. Inside the Hollow House, a dozen children slept safely in their beds, protected by love and determination, and the fierce courage of a woman who had refused to let the world's cruelty define her worth. In the main room, the quilt hung on the wall like a banner of triumph, its intricate patterns catching the last glow of the dying fire. Each stitch was a prayer, each patch a promise that broken things could be made whole, that outcasts could find belonging, and that love was stronger than the cruelest intentions of small-minded people. Dinah McCrae had begun as a woman, scorned standing alone at an altar, while laughter echoed around her. She had become something far greater, a mother to the motherless, a protector of the innocent, and living proof that the measure of a person's worth is not found in the opinions of others, but in the love they choose to give, and the courage they show in defending those who cannot defend themselves. The quilt would hang in the Hollow House for generations, its colors fading, but its story growing stronger with each retelling. And long after Dinah McCrae had passed into legend, children would trace its patterns with wondering fingers and learn the truth that she had discovered in her darkest hour, that every ending is also a beginning, and that the most beautiful things are often sewn together from pieces that others have thrown away. In the end, that was her legacy. Not the laws that bore her name or the scandal that had rocked the territory, but the simple truth that love could triumph over cruelty, that families could be chosen as well as born, and that sometimes the very people society discards are the ones who possess the greatest capacity for changing the world. The outcast's quilt became a symbol of hope for anyone who had ever been made to feel worthless, a reminder that their story was not over, that their scars could become sources of strength, and that somewhere, someone was waiting to help them weave their broken pieces into something beautiful and whole. And in the quiet hours of that Christmas Eve, as the fire settled into glowing embers and the snow continued to fall, Dinah McCrae smiled in her sleep, surrounded by the children who called her mother, and wrapped in the warmth of the family she had chosen and the love she had earned through her refusal to let cruelty have the final word.